Hello everyone and welcome to Doing It on Purpose, a new CIH podcast series hosted by me, Josie Twinning, exclusively for CIH members. In this series, we'll dive into conversations with women about work. We want to share stories, experiences, wisdom and all the messiness too. This is a space for women to belong, to reflect and to get lost in as we find out who we are and do it on purpose. Famous words from the rightly revered Dolly Parton. In today's launch episode, coinciding with International Women's Day 2023, I'm catching up with Kate Still. Kate is the founder of the Good Girl Survival Club and an experienced housing professional. Today, Kate and I talk about the state of the UK housing system, why it's where it is and what we can do. And we talk about the toxicity that can be in the workplace when you're a woman and some of the things that have helped Kate that we wanted to share with you today. I very much hope you enjoy this podcast and do let me know what you think or what you might like to hear in the future. Hi, Kate. Hi. Sorry, I was just getting coffee. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you so much for being on our podcast. We decided to do this podcast because of International Women's Day, which is coming up. And I wanted to kick off talking about this year's International Women's Day because I know it's made you a little bit cross. They're my words, you might not use that adjective, but you've got some thoughts about the theme of this year, which is embrace equity and the whole idea of hugging yourself. And I wondered if you wanted to share what you think about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I have a sort of tortured relationship with International Women's Day because I think the principle of raising the sort of systemic discrimination that women face globally is really important. But I think the way that IWD has evolved, particularly the last few years, really is this sort of co-option, I guess, of sort of mainstream attitudes which are, you know, inherently misogynistic towards women. And this particular theme, you know, this sort of embrace equity idea, which is this sort of ironic positioning of the solution to millennia of abuse and discrimination against women being that we just hug ourselves. You know, I often think to myself, maybe Emmeline Pankhurst should have been told to give herself a cuddle, and then all of this sort of stuff, this kerfuffle would have been sorted out many years ago. So I think, you know, for me, it's been a bit of an insult this year, you know, and a kind of thing, what on earth's going on in the IWD marketing team, where, you know, the basic principles of what it's supposed to be about have clearly not been understood. So yes, I found it quite infuriating making, but equally it's kind of generated quite a lot of content in me in terms of producing, you know, just explanations to people about why this is just exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. You know, we should be talking about discrimination openly and we should be tackling it head on rather than this sort of, you know, trying to pacify people that have no interest in equality towards women at all. You know, I feel like saying to myself, what is it International Women's Day suggesting that we do? You know, kind of go on to those Twitter abusers that slide into the DMs of women and send their pictures of their genitals and say, you know, give yourself a hug, misogynist, and, you know, maybe you won't want to do that towards women anymore. So it is offensive, I think, and yeah, it's something that has made me very cross. You're right.
I think you're not alone. I think I've seen a lot of people this year particularly cross about it, which is, I feel you're totally right when you say, but that's good because it's raising awareness and it's making us think more deeply about it. If you were thinking about International Women's Day, what's some of the stuff that you've seen or you've experienced where you think actually that really is a decent activity that helps women?
I think a lot of the kind of growing, there's a lot of movement now on, you know, in this sort of social media space really around feminist-led organisations that are driving proper narratives around what the real issues are for women. And so kind of, you know, all of those organisations that have, you know, they're sort of providing the counterbalance against some of that kind of mainstream workplace narrative that you see in sort of equality and diversity activities are all about, you know, helping women deal with imposter syndrome or confidence building. And actually now there's a counterbalance narrative around that, kind of in the feminist movement, that talks about how all of that is absolute nonsense, really. And I think that's, for me, that's like a, you know, it's like a sudden kind of sunshine coming into that space, because as a woman it has been incredibly depressing to constantly be referred to as the problem in all of these sort of situations. So, you know, being seen as, you know, we've got to be fixed in order to fit into this space effectively, and that all of the deficit and kind of pathological problems sit within us, and I think it's a real nonsense. And certainly, I have an organisation that does a lot of education work around the impact of patriarchy on individuals and organisations. And for me, it's that work that is the most inspiring, because it's actually telling and educating women about their own oppression, which many women, this kind of systemic discrimination that we experience is so culturally ingrained that even the women don't know they're experiencing it. So I think those women that are kind of opening up that conversation and pushing back on some of these narratives, that it's not about us, it's about the system that is working against us, I think is really inspiring and powerful.
That's really useful, and also exciting for me to hear. I think there's two things you said which I personally love. One is the deficit. There's something in you that needs fixing, or you have to fill something up, or you have to change something. And secondly, I'm definitely in that group of women that didn't understand what was happening until someone told me I had a corporate broom stuck up my bottom. They didn't use that language, and I suddenly realised I didn't have to fit that mould. And it was one of those things that was said sort of as a throwaway comment, and it made me really think about, well, what did that mean? Who was I, and what was my place in the world, and what was it that my purpose was here to do? And I think so many of us, well, for me, it came really late, or it felt late. Like, I think other people had got it much earlier, and you have to unpick the systems, the narrative, and so much of what you've learned or been told how to do or how to behave all need shifting, and that takes quite a lot to get your head around. And I think the women that you talk about that are leading some of these organizations in that space are doing essential work. I wonder at the end whether we could link to some of those, and we could put some of those organizations in, if anybody wants to go and find out more about some of the things that you mentioned. Hey, can I ask you, what makes you tick? So for anyone that doesn't know you very well or hasn't come across you and is listening to this, what are some of the things that you're passionate about and that make you you?
It's a difficult question. I think probably my sort of formative years were sort of very instrumental in who I've become, really, and probably quite a sort of not a strange mix, but probably as of today quite an unusual mix. So I grew up in a single parent family with a mum who at the time was a lollipop lady. My dad, he left their family home when I was about 7, but beforehand he had been a very, very active Marxist. So I was brought up in this sort of hotbed really of activism and living on a council estate. My dad was also the local councillor and had the housing portfolio. So I always had this sort of understanding about kind of systemic discrimination and what was going on in sort of, the sort of structural implications of housing policy and how that kind of panned itself out, really. And then later on, my mum became a born again Christian. And then, we were sort of living, below the poverty line for a lot of that period of time. But we had this incredible community of people around us who supported us through that. And it was very difficult, but the power of community being really, really important, and the transformative power of communities like that that don't need paternalistic intervention. So in terms of my kind of passion for housing, it comes from that experience of direct lived experience of being in those communities, and also the injustices that you experience. So I lived on a big estate in a new town. I went to a school that had a terrible reputation in the local area, and very, very much kids like me from that school were kind of labelled as as a problem, really. And it was always interesting to me, because that's not, I was always very kind of studious. I just used to spend a lot of time in the library and kind of learning, and I very much didn't fit in there. So I had this sort of dual experience of kind of experiencing extreme poverty and what it's like to live in a community like that, but equally not fitting in there anywhere. So I think a lot of my kind of formative years were spent sort of feeling like I didn't fit in anywhere. And then I won a scholarship. I went to London School of Economics, which was really, just sort of catapulted me into a completely different group of people. So I suddenly became friends with a guy whose dad was the ambassador to Russia, and had all of these really kind of mind-blowing experiences of just people from very, very different background to me. So I think diversity of thought and experience has always been something that I've kind of been passionate about. So what makes me tick, really, at essence, is probably both of my parents, evangelical Christian and the Marxist element, kind of be combining together in a very weird way, which is that I'm primarily driven by concepts of social justice, and that's why I came into housing. That's why I wanted to do what I do in housing, and it's why I'm frustrated with housing a lot of the time.
Thank you. You mentioned when you were talking about growing up is feeling like an outsider, but yet understanding the power of community. Do you think that we've we've got that right? Is there still a lot to do on that community bit? Does it work well in certain places? Does it not work well?
I think, one of the things that I was always really conscious of is how annoying it was when people came into that community and tried to tell you what you should be doing, and their perspective of your life and your experience, which was often incredibly patronising. So I think for me it is, if we give people the basic foundations of a good life, which is a home that you can live in, and the sort of support that you need in basic services, community will sort itself out. Many of our issues are about just the systemic lack of basic foundational needs being met. I know certainly in my work in mental health, one of the reasons I've been so interested in mental health throughout my entire life really is because of my experiences in those communities and the impact that that kind of poverty has on your mental health. And so, and understanding it's purely contextual. It's not that loads of people have got mental health problems and then become poor. It's the other way around. And I think it's kind of really understanding that has been something which I'm incredibly passionate about, trying to change the context for people, and then everything else tends to flow from that really.
I think that point about, do you have a mental health crisis or do you have an environmental factor which has affected your mental health, is a really interesting debate, and it affects women, I think, much more greatly than men. Do you think that's right?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, and interestingly, over the last sort of 30 or 40 years, there's a really, really interesting book actually which talks about the crisis of mental health and capitalism really, and I'll give you the name of it. It's by a guy called James Davies, and it's a fascinating look at how we have at societal level framed mental health as being about something that is pathological within the individual, and actually that has been co-opted primarily by pharmaceutical industry, in terms of driving demand for things like antidepressants and things like that, when actually the vast majority of the principles of good mental health are environmental. And I think that is really, it's a really, really important issue when we're thinking about stigmatization and all of the different elements that go together and kind of cut across each other in the communities that we work with, and how we're viewing people that have difficult experiences like that.
And rather than treating the difficulty, treating why that difficulty has risen. I was fascinated. So James David, he's written another book which I've read recently, and I can't remember, but I'll put the link in, which I think you've read too, because we've both shared it on LinkedIn, talking about the DSM, which is the
Diagnostic Manual for Mental Health.
Yeah, and that it's essentially a group of white men that sit round and talk about what they think should be classed as a mental disorder, and it's mushroomed, and some of that research is informed by pharmaceutical companies. I've probably made that argument reductive, but once you start to understand the system, it's incredibly enlightening into then why women in particular are framed with mental health issues, and that is then the problem, not the environmental factors that they're facing or have faced that is the problem.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one, because I work as an executive coach now, and so many organisations have approached me historically and said, "Oh, come in and coach this woman for me because she's always crying in the toilets," and try and sort her out. And my feedback to them is, maybe think about why that woman is crying in the toilets. What's going on in your organisation that's making that happen. So for me it is about reframing that context, that this is not about changing individuals, it's about changing environment.
And have you had much success with that line of think about your systems and how you're behaving, not the individual? How's the response to that been?
I think it's an interesting one. I mean, you do tend to have to go into a much more expansive conversation about exactly what we're talking about here. Is this lens that we've looked at mental health through at a societal level, and I think it's an emerging theme where people are starting to understand that. But certainly, I think already there's so much in workplaces that has a tendency to sort of label and individualize issues on individuals, and actually that's not the problem. It is usually contextual that drives all of these kind of challenges that we experience.
Okay, you had said to me before that working in an organisation had become too problematic for your mental health. Is some of the things that we're talking about, is that what had happened to you, and did that enable you to then make the decision to be self-employed and to go and do exciting things that you're doing?
I think it's a long sort of history, I guess, in terms of, I've often worked as a consultant over the years, and I think I've worked a lot on what are my personal values and what are my challenges, and I know that my certainly my personal values and drivers are not necessarily coherent with a corporate setting in particular. So, I'm a very autonomous person. I like to have autonomy. I like to be able to think about things deeply, and that's not very often not what's possible in many corporate environments. And I think, for me, it was about, particularly in the housing sphere, because it's so important to me, because I have that direct lived experience of it. There were just too many things for me at a sector level, not necessarily at an individual organisational level, that just became, I wanted to be able to talk about, and it's very difficult to talk about that when you are part of an organisation. So part of it was about, I had lots of, family challenges and caring burdens and things like that. So that was the primary driver when I sort of went out on my own, to have more flexibility, if anything, really. But it was about, kind of knowing that I have a voice and wanting that voice to be heard more, and wanting to be able to say the difficult stuff that you can't say when you're an exec in a existing organisation.
I'm really pleased that you can say what you want to say, because I love listening to what you say and what you're writing. So thank you. Even though it was probably at personal cost to you, and it was a hugely sort of brave decision when you have people that need you, I think what you put in the world makes it a little bit better. Kate, you're studying for a degree in psychology and neuroscience in mental health. Tell us about that and what you're learning and how you're finding it.
It's absolutely fascinating. So, I've always had an interest in psychology, and for a long time I really considered about whether I should have, a long time ago, about whether I should have become a psychiatrist. And over the last sort of few years or so, part of my own journey has been about kind of discovering what really drives me. And one of the things that my own coach said to me, actually, about 5 or 6 years ago, was, what do people seek you out for? And that's a good indicator of where your strengths sit. And pretty much, the answer to that question was that people usually come to me for personal advice. And even from being a child, people at school would come and tell me absolutely, really difficult, horrific things they were dealing with, and ask for help. So that's always been something I've kind of focused on, really. So I think it was a realization during lockdown, bizarrely. I kind of coped my mental health by doing academic studies. So I did a course at Oxford during that time, which people kind of can't quite comprehend. But I've really learned that learning and being able to stretch myself academically is something that I've wanted to do. I've always wanted to go and do a PhD again. So this is a conversion process of my current master's degree, with the hope that I'll go on to do PhD study, and primarily because so many of the people that I now work with in coaching, and I work with a lot of chief executives, the core thing that they really want is mental health support, and to a degree, some form of cognitive behavioural therapy. So there's a combination that I'll be working through is how to evolve that kind of solution that sits in a sort of interconnecting space between coaching and psychotherapy.
You mentioned the chief execs that you are working with. The primary thing, or one of the common themes that they are all talking to you about, is mental health. Is that feels like quite a modern thing that they might be worried about?
I think it's always been there. I think many chief execs now are much more aware of it. Their need to kind of develop balance. Many of them have got, and I work with a lot of women, and a lot of women and neurodiverse people who've got lots of other kind of issues in their life. And so, one of the things that they tend to be quite conscious of is the need to kind of balance all of these different demands in themselves, and recognizing when they're not coping. And I think that is an incredible strength. Many chief execs in the past, the kind of archetype of a chief exec that's under stress would be sort of hard drinking, that kind of approach. And people don't do that anymore, which is great. So they're actually reaching out and being much more self-aware, which I think is real progress. And also thinking about, it's a very lonely place. Being a chief exec is an extremely lonely place to be, and you do need to talk about all of those things. It can seriously undermine your self-esteem. You can get some incredible challenges that you have to deal with. You deal with difficult boards and all sorts of things like that, and you're very much on your own. So I think it is a natural progression, really, for chief execs to be seeking that kind of support.
You talked about how a chief exec might have dealt with it a number of years ago. One of the things that I'm interested in is your thoughts on resilience training.
Yeah, I don't believe in it. I think the kind of the framework of resilience, or how it's been applied in many kind of corporate contexts, is a sort of a deflection from the real issues of many organisations. So, again, when people approach me, and organisations do approach me about delivering resilience training, my question to them usually is, what do you mean? Because if it's that, you've got people who've got, and this happens quite a lot, people have just got too much to do, and we're telling them that they're moaning too much about it, and we just want you to be more resilient. Well, that's not resilience. Okay, there is such a thing as having too much to do. So what you need to do is is change that for them. And again, it's often about, we're asking particularly, typically traditionally marginalised groups like Black and ethnic minority employees, like women who experience day-to-day, significant microaggressions, which can really affect you in the long term. And we say to people, just buck up and deal with it. And so it's kind of really getting to the bottom of, in any organisation that thinks it needs resilience training, what really is that about? Okay, if it's that you're telling people stop moaning, or just have a thick skin when it comes to how people are treating you, that's not resilience training. And we need to really focus on how to resolve those kind of issues in an organisation.
I wanted to ask you a question about neoliberalism, and I think from what I've read about the things that you write and you talk about, you use that term and the fact that the approach of neoliberalism can undermine housing policy. Now I had to Google what neoliberalism was, and I can't even say it. I mean, it's brilliant. I wonder, for those of us that aren't particularly adept at understanding it, what is it? What is the type of approach? What is neoliberalism in approach, and why do you think it undermines housing policy?
Well, I think, it's basically the predominant economic sort of framework that most Western economies have used for the last 30 to 50 years, essentially. And what at its roots, what it's about is the principle. Probably the easiest way to describe it is the principle of trickle down, is the foundational philosophy of neoliberalism. So if you do all of this, if you build shared ownership, or if you build market rented properties and you regenerate an area, then the poorest people in society are going to benefit from that. Now, I know, I spent 4 years at London School of Economics. It was pretty much discredited about 30 years ago as a concept. So we know trickle down doesn't work, and yet we persist with it over and over again. And we don't deal with the cognitive dissonances that arise in housing policy around some of these, quite incompatible things that we're trying to achieve at the same time. So, I think it's driven a lot of behaviours in the sector which I think are extremely damaging, and which we're now sort of scratching our heads in terms of the outcomes we're starting to see from what does this kind of long-term application of these kind of principles mean for communities and for individual properties, even at that level. It means underinvestment. It means that we have essentially asset stripped the social housing sector in order to fund the development of homes for middle class people. And many people might say to us, well, middle class people need homes too. Well, yes, they do. But in a constrained environment where there are constrained resources, you have to prioritise. And for me, my ethical and moral framework would say you prioritise the people who don't have a home at all first. So, I think for me, that's what's undermining, is that we think this cognitive dissonance that we have in the sector, where we think we can do both of these things and get the best outcomes for both levels, and you just can't.
And so, is there an approach or something that you think could be better than neoliberalism?
I think there's definitely, I wish I knew the answer to that question. And it's a very, very difficult transition, because obviously you're working in a global system, and we're sort of fully committed to that. I do think there is a housing association level, or a sector level, there are things that we could do to change the framework of some of the stuff that we're doing, and some of that is pushing back a bit more. So, having to see ourselves potentially as political organisations, where we're not just going to go and nod and scrape and bow and do the things that government wants because they've told us to do it, but actually saying this doesn't make sense, this is not an ethical thing to do. So the recent conversation we had about capping the rents of shared owners but not capping the rents of supported housing, that just seems to me an ethical quagmire. And actually my view of that would be, okay, if we have to comply with that on the shared ownership side, then as boards we also cap it on supported housing, because for me that ethical framework says that's wrong. Okay, why are we capping the rents of people who've got a capital stake in their property, and yet we're letting the most vulnerable people in society have to pay these kind of charges? And we seem to forget, we kind of obfuscate ourselves in the sector and kind of go, well, don't worry, because those people receive all of their money from housing benefit. No, they don't actually. So it's kind of, and also the long-term implications of that approach is that we're actually further residualising supported housing for vulnerable people, because it becomes so expensive that you can only be the most vulnerable person possible and get full benefit in order to live in one of those properties. So these are the kind of challenges that we've got to push back on and think a bit more clearly about, and kind of say either A, this is a political decision and I'm just not going to go along with it, and B, the outlier, and I think being braver is something that we need to do. And certainly I see some of the organisations that I admire the most have dislocated themselves from that political structure. they have not taken housing grant, so they might not be able to do stuff at scale, but you would kind of argue quality over quantity might be a solution, so they're not part of some of those big systemic issues. It's a very difficult answer, as I say. I don't have all of the answers to it, but I do think that recognizing, or at least admitting, this is one of our root cause problems, rather than pretending it's about something else, it's about structures, or it's about a leader that you think you had that was wrong, whatever. Some of this is much more fundamental and systematic and systemic than we think it is.
Thank you. So we're talking at a time when Michael Gove has just announced that he's going to table an amendment to the Social Housing Regulation Bill, which, if passed, would see a number of people working in housing organisations having to have a qualification. What do you think of that, and will it achieve what it seeks to do?
I think it's absolutely the right thing, and I wouldn't, the idea that I'm saying that with the current government is interesting, but it's something I've always advocated. And actually, in all of my previous organisations, I tried to create that professionalisation journey, because I think housing has been, certainly for the last 15 years, I've been in it as an exec for like 15 years, but before that I studied it. I've studied it for 30 years. And it's this kind of, we went through this phase where we talked about, utter nonsense was talked about, that housing was all about customer service. And customer service is a key part of that, but it's not what housing's about, okay? And I think recognising that, and how technical and complex a lot of the stuff that housing, particularly frontline housing officers, have to do, is a really important thing. And it should also elevate the status of those roles within organisations, because for far too long, I was a COO and operations-led leader. That was the kind of poor man of any organisation, was your frontline housing team. It is absolutely central to the success of a housing association. So, it should be elevated to that level of professionalism. It has to be done in combination, though, I think. So, you've got to have the right professional, technical experience, but you also have to have the right people experience as well. So the balance of those two elements need to be sort of factored in together.
What is housing to you? You just mentioned that in that answer about what housing is. What is, and you said it's not about certain things. What is it to you?
For me, it should. Well, what do I think it is? What do I think it is, and what do I think it should be? For me, it's it's one of the last potential bastions of social mobility in this country. And I think, when I think back to my experiences of growing up in social housing, I also got free education because the way education was funding that period of time. And I think, where have I got to in my life because of those kind of pillars of the welfare state? Those things are really, really important and powerful. And they are, from my perspective, some of the greatest things that we've ever done as a nation. And it really saddens me that we've allowed that to be undermined in some way, really. So I think for me, it has potential to be a fabulous, supportive, amazing way of supporting social mobility for people and providing foundational human rights. And I really do believe that housing is a human right. It should not be something which is discretionary on how much you can pay for it.
And before we leave, may I ask you one more question? Can I ask you something that is feeding your soul right now, something that you're reading or listening to that the people who are listening to this might want to join you on experiencing?
I think, again, we'll go back to the theme of International Women's Day. I'm reading a book at the moment by Laura Bates called Fix the System, Not the Women. And I think, again, if any of the things people have been sort of inspired or intrigued by some of the things we talked about today, it's a fantastic book. I read it and at times I cried because it was so reflective of my experience. And particularly the bit she talks a lot about how, women, we kind of go along in isolation with these experiences. And, one of the things that we all know as women is that we must absolutely not do is ever talk about it, because that is, the idea of not being seen as a good girl is one of the worst things that we can be as women. And I think this is just such an amazing book for validating all of that experience and that collective, trauma that many of us are carrying because of the experiences we've had right across society, and our experiences, in schools, in families, in workplaces, etc. So for me, it was like an opening up of and realization that you're not alone. So I would say, if there are women out there who are struggling with some of that stuff, read that book and you will feel you are not alone.
And Kate, you run the Good Girl Survival Club. Can you tell us about that and how people can get involved if they feel like they might like to?
Yes, it's basically something I set up in 2021 with the aim of educating organisations about patriarchy. So, seeing the systemic impact that patriarchy has on all aspects of women's lives. And we do work directly with organisations. We also do I do individual coaching and group coaching. We run away days. We run an online membership club, which is just about to launch actually in the next couple of months. And it's really about building a community of women to sort of help and support women to survive and thrive. We also do a lot of work talking about the kind of great resignation. A lot of the work we do at the moment is helping women who want to go out on their own, who want to leave the corporate environment, which has been really fascinating, and kind of getting insight on that whole narrative about, are we quiet quitting or whatever. What I'm seeing is that women, what COVID did for women was make them wake up to the fact they could go out and do something on their own, and they didn't have to kind of comply with these narratives anymore, which is really fantastic and empowering. And so we are supporting a lot of women to set up businesses as well, and to kind of go out and live life on their own terms for once.
That sounds incredible. And if you're an individual rather than an organisation and don't have a massive budget, is there a way to get involved with the Good Girl Survival Club without having a sort of organisational fee behind you?
Yes, so we're about to launch the online membership club, which will be a fee of about sort of £25 a month, and you can come along to virtual online membership meetings. You can be part of our sort of information network and also get discounts for our sort of face-to-face events, our networking, etc. And that. But we're about to launch that. My partner and I looking at rolling that out very shortly, so we can also include some information about that once it's out there.
Thank you, it's awesome. I love talking to you. Thank you so much.